Hi, welcome to Classroom 101. This is the RE department's first attempt at a flipped lesson. A flipped lesson means that during your homework time you're going to cover a large part of the content we'd normally look at in class, and then when you come to your next lesson our focus will be on higher level thinking in the form of discussion. To be successful in this homework you're going to need to make sure that you watch the whole video and complete the homework sheet. At the end of your homework, we will check that you're able to know who Plato was and when he lived. You should be able to retell the allegory of the cave. And finally, you will have generated questions which you will bring to class ready for your next lesson. So, keep calm and do your homework. Let's just recap what you've done in the last couple of lessons in class. If you remember, you did a series of sense experiments and you were aiming to test the reliability of the information that your senses gave you. At the end of this, you as a class drew conclusions about the reliability of your senses, and we did that so that you could each make a judgment as to which type of knowledge you believed was most reliable. Remember, rational knowledge is knowledge that's gained through logical thinking, whereas empirical knowledge relies mainly on our senses. Let's remind ourselves of the conclusions that you came up with 5 conclusions as a class. Each of these conclusions about the senses led to a very clear idea that actually our senses can trick us. As a result of this, most of you believe that your empirical knowledge was less reliable than your rational knowledge. We're going to now have a look at a rationalist philosopher and explore these ideas a little bit more. Let me introduce you. So, Plato, an ancient Greek. He was an ancient Greek because obviously he lived and taught in Greece. He was based in Athens. Plato lived a long time before Christ. He was probably born around 428 BC. And whilst he is a very dead philosopher, lots of his thinking influences philosophy today. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about one of his well-known ideas that we're going to look at, and it's based around an allegory. So, here comes a key word. Allegory. If you don't already know what this word means, it would be sensible to pause and write it down now. An allegory is a story used to explain a more complicated idea. It's important that you understand that when an allegory is told, it is in no way real. And if it is in no way real, you also have to accept that the story itself is not true. The really important thing about allegories is the meaning or the more complicated idea that they're trying to explain. And so we're going to have a look at Plato's allegory of the cave. In this, Plato is teaching us something about empirical knowledge, sense knowledge, compared to rational or logical thinking knowledge. Rather than reading you the allegory, I'd like to show you a video. So, sit back and enjoy the show. But whilst you're watching it, remember to be thinking about what is it that Plato is trying to get us to understand about empirical knowledge.
Imagine prisoners that have spent their entire lives chained deep inside a cave. They have been chained so that they cannot see behind themselves, and they are forced to stare endlessly at the cave wall in front of them. Behind them a fire is burning, and between the prisoners and the fire is a raised walkway. Now imagine that each day a menagerie of objects crosses the walkway. Animals and people carrying their wares to market. Their shapes create an intricate shadow play on the wall in front of the prisoners. This is the only world that the prisoners have ever known. The shadows and the echoes of unseen objects. Now, imagine that the prisoner is released. After some time adjusting to the blinding light, the freed prisoner will begin to experience the world outside of the cave for the very first time. And it is like nothing he could have ever imagined. With his new perception of the world, the man will of course want to return to his friends to share his incredible discoveries. But the prisoners cannot recognize their old friend. He appears as all things do. His voice is a distorted echo, and his body is a grotesque shadow. They cannot understand his fantastic stories of the world outside of the cave. To them, it will never exist. This, of course, does not make the world outside of the cave any less real.
So that's the allegory of the cave. I wonder whether now you could sketch a scene of the cave that Plato describes. Why not pause the video for a minute and have a go? Okay, so perhaps you've ended up with a sketch that maybe looks something like this. As you can see clearly, we have the prisoner sitting down at the bottom, facing the back wall of the cave. Onto that cave wall are the shadows of the objects that the people are carrying along this pathway, the light from the fire creating the shadow. The shadow itself is twisted and distorted. It doesn't give a true picture of the reality of the objects being carried. And then right back at the far end of the cave is the cave entrance. Outside of there is the sunlight and the real world. Or maybe your sketch looked a bit more like this. Still, all the important features are here. So, the question we now have is, what do the shadows represent? What does the light and the real world outside represent? Once again, you might like to pause the video and jot down your own answers to these questions. Let's have a look at what Plato was basically saying. First of all, the prisoners who are chained inside the cave in that darkness. They're like the people who rely only on the physical world for their knowledge. They trust the sense evidence that they're receiving. They rely on empirical data. For Plato, if we just rely on what our senses tell us, we're rather like the people that are trusting the shadows. The shadows, whilst not completely fake, are not true pictures of reality. The shadows are twisted and inaccurate. And Plato believes that if we trust our senses and this world for our knowledge, we end up with inaccurate knowledge, knowledge which is not indubitable. So then, the light and the world outside the cave. This, for Plato, is the truth. We can only arrive at this truth, according to Plato, by rational thinking, by using logic. And furthermore, Plato believes that truth exists outside this world. He actually thinks there is another world. And it is only in knowing this that we really can know the truth. This is a fairly complicated idea. So, We've thought about the cave, but what are we left with? Well, hopefully you're left with some questions. You've been asked to write down 3 questions that you have based on what you've seen and thought about in this homework. Maybe you'll end up with questions about reality. After all, if the physical world that we live in is not the truth, where do we find reality? Is it possible to argue that this is not real? Maybe you'll have questions about truth, or perhaps even about hope. Whatever your questions are, bring them to class next lesson, and that's when our real philosophical thinking will begin.